A small beggar found a briefcase with $1 million belonging to a millionaire and returned it. When the boy said what he wanted in return, the millionaire burst into tears. Logan was a boy of only 10 years old, with tousled brown hair and big eyes that reflected an uncommon sadness for his age. His face was dirty, marked by days without bathing, and his clothes, little more than rags, didn't protect him from the intense cold. He spent his days on the street, seeking some gesture of kindness that never came. Even being so young, he already knew the harshness of life more than many people who passed by him every day. Logan was sitting on the sidewalk in front of the bakery, legs crossed and hands stuffed into the pockets of an old coat that provided no warmth. The cold was biting, and his stomach growled loudly, begging for food. A lady in a blue coat stopped in front of him, her eyes narrowed with disdain. "You street kids are just a nuisance. Why don't you find a job instead of begging here?" Logan raised his head and replied, his voice weak but firm, "I would do that if someone gave me a chance." The woman arched her eyebrow, surprised by the response. "A chance? You think the world is fair to those who don't strive? Don't expect anyone to feel sorry for you," she said, her voice as cutting as the cold wind that blew. Logan swallowed hard but didn't look away. "I don't want pity. I just want a piece of bread so I don't pass out," he mumbled. Other passers-by slowed down, attracted by the argument. A man in a thick coat stopped and sneered. "Look, he has a ready answer. This kid is getting cheeky," he commented, and some laughs accompanied his remark. Logan felt his face burn, but he didn't want to be quiet. "Cheeky is walking past me every day and pretending not to see me," he retorted, his eyes watering. The man frowned, offended. He took a step forward and pointed at Logan. "You're just a burden on this city. You should learn to shut up when adults speak. People like you don't deserve anything but contempt," he said loudly, causing others to stop and watch. Logan held back the tears that threatened to fall. "I didn't ask to be here. If I could, I would disappear and leave you all in peace," he said, his voice choked. The woman who had started the argument huffed and looked around. "Someone needs to do something about these vagrants. They dirty the streets and shame the city," she exclaimed, as if Logan were a disposable object. An elderly lady leaving the bakery with bags stopped and nodded in agreement. "They should be taken away from here." "They're always around like rats," she added. Logan felt the weight of each word like stones thrown at him. "Rats? Is that how you see us?" he thought, and this time he couldn't hold back the tears. "I'm not a rat. I'm just a hungry boy," he said out loud, his eyes defiant but wet. The response provoked murmurs among the small crowd that had formed. The man laughed again, but this time with more anger. "Insolent boy, have you no shame? Instead of hiding, you answer as if you were someone important," he shouted, giving Logan's shoe a light kick, just enough to push him back to the ground. Logan fell to the side and felt the pain spread through his arm, but he didn't groan. "Shame? I lost that a long time ago," he thought, but still replied, panting. "Shame is having so much and not sharing anything." The rain began to fall, the first icy drops touching Logan's skin. People started to disperse, some casting quick disapproving glances, others simply ignoring the fallen boy. The woman in the blue coat looked at him one last time and spat on the ground near him. "I hope this rain washes you away from here forever," she said before walking away. The boy, wet and hurt, closed his eyes for a moment, trying to feel something other than pain and hunger. The rain was increasing, running down his face and mixing with the tears he could no longer control. "Will anyone ever really hear me?" he thought, as the icy water soaked his clothes. Logan tried to get up, but his legs didn't obey. The fatigue and cold left him dizzy, and he fell again, this time with his forehead resting on the wet sidewalk. "I can't anymore," he whispered, his vision blurring. The voices around faded, and he felt his body giving up. "If someone finds me, let it be before it's too late," was his last thought before losing consciousness. The rain didn't stop, and Logan, motionless, barely felt the icy drops hitting his skin. The sidewalk reflected the flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the street. The world seemed to continue, indifferent to the small body lying on the ground. "No one cares," echoed in his now distant mind. The cold and loneliness enveloped him completely. He no longer felt anything. The rain was still falling when Logan opened his eyes, feeling his body ache and freeze. He tried to get up, but his muscles protested, exhausted. The street was almost deserted, and only the dim light of the street lamps illuminated his surroundings. That's when he heard a soft, almost hesitant voice. "Are you okay?" He looked up and saw a girl with brown hair tied in a ponytail, dressed in a blue and white school uniform. She was holding a colorful umbrella and watching him with curious and concerned eyes. Logan tried to respond, but hunger and fatigue silenced his voice. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the girl insisted, taking a step forward. Her mother, a severe-faced woman with a rigid expression, firmly pulled her arm. "Zoe, don't talk to strangers, especially those kinds of boys," her mother said with disdain, making her prejudice clear. Logan felt his face burn, not with shame but with anger. He knew he wasn't dangerous, just hungry and alone. "Those kinds? I'm just a boy," he thought, staring at the mother with a defiant look. Zoe freed her arm from her mother's grip and knelt beside Logan. "Here, take this," she said, taking a sandwich from the lunchbox she was carrying. The smell of fresh ham and cheese made Logan's stomach growl even louder. He hesitated, looking at Zoe and then at her mother, who was rolling her eyes and crossing her arms, annoyed. "If I eat fast, she won't have time to scold more," Logan thought, taking the sandwich with trembling hands. "Thanks," he mumbled before taking a hurried bite. Zoe's mother huffed impatiently. "Zoe, you don't know where this boy has been. People like that live under bridges with no hygiene. Now get up and let's go before anyone sees us near him," she said with disdain. Zoe looked at her mother firmly. "He's just hungry, Mum." "It's not a crime to help," she retorted, but her mother only pulled her harder. Logan bit the sandwich quickly, trying to absorb as much as possible before it was gone. "Even while being humiliated, I can still get something good," he thought, feeling the tears threaten to fall. The sandwich seemed the best thing he had eaten in years. Each bite filled him not only with food, but with a forgotten feeling that someone cared, even if just for a moment. Zoe watched him with a discreet smile, while her mother, visibly disgusted, tapped her fingers on the umbrella. "Let's go, Zoe. I don't want anyone to think we're mingling with those kinds of people," she said in a cold tone. Zoe gave Logan one last look before being dragged away by her mother. "See you around," she mumbled, her voice sad. Logan stood still, the taste of the sandwich still in his mouth, and his heart warmed by that unexpected gesture. Maybe there are still good people, he thought as he watched Zoe walk away down the street. He took a deep breath, feeling a new wave of strength spread through his body. "I need to keep going, I can't give up now," he muttered, pushing himself to stand up. He began walking down the streets, his bare feet making noise on the wet sidewalk. The sound of rain was diminishing, and the clouds were starting to dissipate, revealing a dark sky dotted with stars. The city, now calmer, seemed a little less hostile. Logan passed by shop windows that were closed, where his tired reflection stared back at him. "One day I'll be more than this," he promised himself, feeling the cold cut his skin but ignoring it. It was then, as he turned a corner, that Logan noticed an elderly man in a wheelchair being assisted by a driver. The man had neatly trimmed grey hair and wore a black suit. The driver was trying to transfer him from the wheelchair to the car seat, but in the process, a dark briefcase slipped from the man's lap and fell to the ground with a dull thud. Logan stopped immediately, his gaze fixed on the briefcase. Could it be important? He thought as he watched the busy driver, unaware of the fallen object. He took a hesitant step toward the briefcase. The sound of the street was distant, as if the world had stopped at that moment. As he got closer, the partially open lid revealed stacks of neatly arranged cash. Logan felt his heart race. "This could change my life," he thought, as the echo of his mother's voice filled his mind. Always be honest. He knew he could grab the briefcase and run before anyone noticed, but something inside held him back. "What would you do, Mum?" he asked himself, his eyes fixed on the briefcase that now seemed to weigh tons. His stomach growled, and hunger and exhaustion tried to convince him to make a rash decision. "With this, I would never go hungry again," he thought, but his mother's voice continued, stubborn in his mind. The man in the wheelchair, noticing Logan's movement, turned his face with a tired but curious look. "Hey kid, did you see my briefcase?" he asked, his voice hoarse but firm. Logan swallowed hard, unsure whether to answer or just run. "Yes, sir, it's here," he said, his voice coming out as a whisper as he pointed to the object. Logan, the briefcase still in his hands, took a hesitant step toward the man in the wheelchair. The weight of the decision was immense, but he knew returning it was the right thing to do. "Here it is, sir," he said, extending the briefcase. Charles, with a surprised look, took the object back, feeling the rare honesty of that boy reflected in his tired eyes. "Son, do you realize what you just did?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Logan just shook his head, still unsure of what would come next. "I just did what my mum taught me," he thought, feeling a lump in his throat. Charles looked the boy up and down, noticing his soaked clothes and skeletal appearance. He realized Logan was shivering, not just from the cold, but from hunger and exhaustion. "Are you alone? Where are your parents?" he asked, concern evident in his tone. Logan averted his gaze, ashamed. "I don't have anyone. I lost my parents a year ago. I'm alone in this world. By the way, my name is Logan," he mumbled, and the words seemed to weigh like lead. The silence between them lasted only an instant, but it was enough for Charles to make a decision. "Come with me, Logan, I'll take you to a safe place," he said, with a determination that didn't allow for argument. The driver looked surprised at the boss. "Sir Charles, are you sure?" he asked while Logan watched, trying to understand what that meant. Charles nodded without taking his eyes off the boy. "Yes, of course. This boy has demonstrated an honesty that I have not seen in many adult men. Logan comes with us." "It's the least I can do," he stated firmly. Logan felt his heart race. "Is it true? Am I going somewhere better?" he thought, not believing his unexpected luck. The driver opened the back door of the car and gestured for Logan to get in. With his clothes still dripping and his body aching, he hesitated for a second before accepting. The warmth of the car enveloped him immediately, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time. Charles observed Logan with a concerned look. "We'll take care of you, boy, don't worry," he said, and Logan could only mutter, "Thank you, sir." The journey to the mansion was silent, with only the sound of rain hitting the glass. Logan looked out the window, watching the city lights whiz by. His heart beat at a pace he could barely keep up with. "Is this real? Am I really on my way to a safe place?" he wondered internally, while the image of his mother's smile in his mind gave him a spark of comfort. "I hope she's seeing this," he thought, with a pang in his chest. When the car stopped in front of the large mansion, Logan's eyes widened. The iron gates opened slowly, revealing an impeccably tended garden and the imposing facade of the house. The driver got out first and helped Charles exit, while Logan remained motionless, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. "Come on, Logan, you're home now," said Charles with an encouraging smile. Logan took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, feeling the night's chill dissipating by the warmth of anticipation. But as soon as he set foot at the mansion's entrance, a tall, slender figure appeared. It was a man Logan would later learn was named Malcolm, the butler, with an austere demeanor and a cold stare. He looked Logan up and down and then turned to Charles. "Sir, you've brought someone." "Unusual today," he commented with a hint of disdain. Charles frowned, ignoring the provocation. "Yes, Malcolm. He'll be staying here. Prepare something warm for him to eat and make sure he feels welcome," he ordered. Malcolm nodded with a forced smile. "Of course, sir." "As you wish," he said. But as soon as he turned, he muttered to himself, "I'll show that boy this place isn't for him." Logan caught Malcolm's gaze and felt a chill. "Why is he looking at me with such contempt? What did I do to him?" he thought, trying not to show fear. Charles put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're safe here, Logan. Good people like you shouldn't be out on the streets, especially at your age," he said, in a tone that conveyed protection. Logan nodded, trying to believe the words, even with the uncomfortable feeling of Malcolm's gaze upon him. The entrance to the mansion was even more impressive on the inside. The marble floor gleamed under the light of a large crystal chandelier, and the walls were adorned with antique paintings and tapestries. Logan felt out of place, like a stain amidst that luxury. "I never thought a place like this existed for real," he whispered, and Charles smiled slightly upon hearing it. "One day, boy, you may have more than you imagine." "You just need to keep that honesty," said the old man, while Malcolm watched them with narrowed eyes. Malcolm leaned slightly toward Charles. "Sir, I'll prepare something for the boy. But I must remind you that we have important visitors tomorrow," he said in a tone that suggested Logan was unwelcome. Charles waved his hand, dismissing the concern. "I don't care about the visitors, Malcolm." "This boy deserves respect and care," he replied, having no patience for the insinuation. Logan overheard the exchange and felt his face flush. "He really cares about me," he thought, still surprised. As Charles was led by the driver into an adjacent room, Malcolm leaned toward Logan and whispered, hiding his voice from the millionaire. "Listen up, kid. This place isn't for you. I'll make your life hell until you leave here of your own accord." Logan's heart raced and he felt his blood run cold. Is he really going to do that? He thought, trying to maintain his composure, but the fear was undeniable. Next, Malcolm led Logan through the mansion's corridors with hurried steps and an impassive look. The walls adorned with expensive paintings, and the polished marble floor seemed to mock the boy, whose damp clothes left small footprints behind him. Logan tried to absorb everything around him, but the weight of Malcolm's gaze made him focus only on moving forward. "This will be your room," Malcolm said dryly, stopping in front of a narrow door. Upon opening the door, Logan found a small space, practically a closet. The walls were stained with mold, and the air had a musty, abandoned smell. There was an old wooden bed with a thin mattress and rough blankets. Malcolm flashed a mocking smile. "The other rooms are under renovation. You'll have to make do with this one for now," he declared, with a cruel glint in his eyes. Logan swallowed hard, trying not to show his disappointment. "Thank you," he muttered, even though he knew this was a deliberate cruelty. Malcolm leaned down until he was at Logan's eye level, his face so close that the boy could feel his icy breath. "I hope you're not expecting a prince's treatment. This is the place you deserve," he whispered, with a sharp voice. "Here, you're just a temporary nuisance, and if it were up to me, you wouldn't stay long." Logan looked up, meeting the butler's gaze with determination. "I'm not expecting anything beyond a place where I can close my eyes," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Inside, anxiety gnawed at him. "Will I be able to withstand living here?" he thought, smelling the strong scent of mold. Malcolm took a step back and let out a dry laugh. "Then enjoy your palace, boy. Don't expect kindness or favors," he said with sarcasm, before turning and leaving, slamming the door hard. Logan sat on the edge of the bed and looked around, realizing that even that room was a luxury compared to the nights he had spent outdoors. "It's still better than the street," he thought, trying to find some comfort in the situation. Minutes later, the door opened again, and Malcolm walked in without knocking, his eyes shining with an air of superiority. "Dinner is ready. Come, but remember, keep quiet and know your place," he ordered, with a tone that seemed like a challenge. Logan nodded and followed the butler down the candle-lit hallways that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Each step feels like a march into the unknown, he thought, his heart racing. Upon entering the dining room, Logan was impressed by the long table, covered in fine linens and filled with gleaming plates and glasses. Charles was already seated at the head, with a serene and attentive look. Malcolm motioned for Logan to take a seat at the far end of the table, away from the other places, and whispered in a cold tone, "Enjoy your meal, boy. It'll be a challenge you won't forget," he said. And Logan felt a chill run down his spine but remained silent. What did he mean by that? He thought, trying to hide his nervousness. The dishes were served, and Logan noticed that his utensils differed from the others. The fork was bent, the knife was blunt, and the spoon was too large, as if they had been chosen on purpose. Malcolm walked past him and gave a cruel smile, his eyes narrowed with satisfaction. "I hope you're comfortable," he whispered venomously. Logan picked up the fork, which could barely cut the meat on his plate. "I won't give up because of this," he thought, struggling to eat without making noise. Charles observed from afar, noticing Logan's efforts to adapt to the situation. "Is everything all right there, Logan?" he asked with a gentle tone that contrasted with the heavy atmosphere. The boy looked up and forced a smile. "Yes, sir. I'm just a little nervous," he replied, trying to appear confident. Malcolm, who was nearby, muttered through gritted teeth, "We'll see how far your courage goes, boy. This is just the beginning." The dinner progressed, and Logan struggled with the clumsy utensils. Every attempt to cut the meat made an irritating sound, drawing suspicious glances from Malcolm. The butler approached with calculated steps and stopped behind the boy, leaning down to whisper, "It's difficult, isn't it? Maybe it would be better if you went back to where you came from. You're not used to silver utensils. This kind of cutlery is not made for people like you, who usually eat with their hands, like animals," he said. Logan took a deep breath, his eyes welling up, but tried to ignore the words. "I can't let him see that I'm hurt," he thought, keeping his head held high. Charles frowned, noticing that something seemed wrong. The boy was eating with difficulty, and there was a tension in the air that he couldn't ignore. Malcolm noticed his master's gaze and leaned in to whisper in his ear, "Sir, it seems the boy is not accustomed to this kind of meal. Perhaps it's above what he's used to." Charles narrowed his eyes, still suspicious, but nodded slightly. "I'm sure Logan will manage," Charles responded, unaware of the cruel things his butler was saying. Logan observed the exchange between them and felt his heart sink. "Did he notice? Does he think I'm failing?" he wondered, trying to maintain his composure. Malcolm walked away with a look of superiority, satisfied with having diverted Charles's attention. "You won't last long here, boy. I'll make sure of that," the butler thought, while Logan continued to struggle with the inadequate utensils. The next day, the morning sun shone on the mansion's gardens, making the dewdrops on the leaves glisten like tiny jewels. Logan, dressed in clean clothes and feeling for the first time in a long time his skin warmed and invigorated after a bath, explored the garden with a shy smile. He touched the colorful flowers and watched the butterflies fluttering among the bushes. For a moment he felt that life might be different. "It's like a dream I don't want to wake up from," he thought, listening to the sound of birds. But the tranquility was interrupted by a sharp voice. "What are you doing here?" asked Hazel, Zoe's mother, her face contorted in an expression of disgust. She was wearing an elegant dress, and her hair was perfectly pinned up. Logan turned, his heart racing as he recognized the woman who had looked at him with disdain on the street. I'm just looking at the flowers, Ma'am," he said, his voice trembling. Hazel took a step forward, her eyes flashing with irritation. "You're the same boy from yesterday. What are you doing on this property?" she ranted, completely ignoring Logan's frightened expression. Zoe came running through the garden, her eyes wide as she saw the scene. "Mother, please, he hasn't done anything wrong. Leave him alone," she pleaded, grabbing her mother's arm tightly. The woman shook her arm free and looked at her daughter sternly. "Zoe, go inside." "I'm not going to discuss this with you," she ordered, her voice as firm as steel. Zoe hesitated, her eyes welling up, but didn't move. "He was just playing, Mother. He's good," she insisted, her voice almost breaking. Logan watched the scene, feeling a mix of fear and gratitude for the girl's defense. "Will she be able to help me?" he thought, his heart racing. Without paying attention to her daughter's pleas, Hazel took her cell phone from her purse and began dialing. Logan felt terror take hold of him. "Ma'am, please, I didn't do anything." He tried to argue, but Hazel just shot him an icy look. "Shut up, I don't want to hear excuses. You're a threat and shouldn't be here," she said, bringing the phone to her ear. "Hello, police? I need you to come immediately. A suspicious boy has broken into Charles's mansion," she spoke, without taking her eyes off Logan. The sound of the words fell like an unbearable weight on the boy. He felt his legs tremble and panic rise in his chest. Zoe began to cry, pulling her mother's arm. "Mom, please don't do this. He's not an intruder," she shouted, but Hazel remained impassive. "Zoe, go inside now," she repeated in a tone that ended the discussion. "I'm going to be taken away." And not even Mr. Charles knows, thought Logan, fear consuming every part of his being. The silence in the garden was interrupted only by Zoe's sobs and the distant sound of approaching sirens. Logan looked around, desperately searching for Charles or any sign that someone would come to help him. But the minutes dragged on, and no one appeared. "He won't know. No one will hear me," he thought, his breathing becoming faster. The sound of sirens intensified, and 2 police cars stopped in front of the mansion's entrance. The officers got out quickly, guns on their hips and watchful looks. Hazel met them at the entrance to the garden and pointed to Logan without hesitation. "There he is. He broke into the property and was lurking in the garden," she said, her voice hard. One of the officers, a man with a serious face, looked at the boy and took a step forward. "Hands up, boy," he ordered, approaching cautiously. Logan raised his hands, his eyes wide and shining with terror. Zoe ran up to one of the officers, clutching his jacket. "Please, sir, he didn't do anything. He was just playing," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. The officer exchanged a look with Hazel, who shook her head impatiently. "He's an intruder, and my family's safety is at stake," she said coldly. Logan felt his hands being pulled behind his back forcefully as a pair of cold handcuffs closed around his wrists. No, this can't be happening, he thought, his chest tightening. The officers lifted him roughly, and Logan felt pain in his wrists and shoulders. I'm not a thief," he said in a trembling voice as the tears finally rolled down his face. Hazel took a step back, watching with cold satisfaction. Zoe sobbed, unable to do anything but watch as Logan was taken away. "Please, call Mr. Charles, he'll explain," Logan shouted, his voice mingling with the surrounding sounds. But Charles didn't appear. The mansion's door remained closed, and Logan's words were lost in the chaos of the scene. The officer pushed the boy toward the patrol car, turning a deaf ear to his protests. "Come on, kid. You'll have a chance to explain yourself at the station," he said in an indifferent voice. Logan looked back at Zoe one last time, who was kneeling in the garden, her hands covering her tear-stained face. He'll know. He has to know, he thought as he felt the patrol car closing around him. Malcolm, watching from a high window, let out a satisfied smile. "Finally, things are going back to their rightful place," he muttered, before disappearing into the dimness of the hallway. Logan, with his face pressed against the cold window of the car, continued to call for Charles, his voice weakening as the sirens cut through the morning silence. The heavy silence in the mansion was broken by the sound of Charles's wheelchair rolling rapidly across the marble floor as he moved through the corridors. His face was marked by serenity and contained curiosity. He stopped in front of Malcolm, who maintained a serene expression, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uneasiness. "Where's Logan, Malcolm? I haven't seen him around the house since early morning," Charles asked, his voice firm and cutting. Malcolm raised his eyebrows, feigning surprise. Sir, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. Mrs. Hazel called the police and they took him." Charles clenched his fists, feeling his blood boil. "Why wasn't I informed immediately?" he growled, his hands gripping the armrests of the wheelchair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Malcolm shrugged, keeping his voice indifferent. "I didn't want to disturb you, sir. I thought it would be better to wait for a more convenient time." Charles wasted no time on further explanations. With swiftness and an expression laden with fury, he headed for the garage, ordering the driver to take him to the police station. This absurdity is going to end now, he thought as the car gained speed. At the station, Logan was sitting on a metal bench, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs that had been removed minutes before. Fear still kept him from breathing properly. Next to him, an officer looked at him with a mixture of disdain and boredom. "Street kid always gets into trouble," he muttered, unconcerned whether Logan could hear him. The boy lowered his head, feeling the tears that stubbornly fell. "It's not fair. I didn't do anything wrong," he thought, his chest tight. The station door burst open and Charles entered like a whirlwind in his wheelchair, his eyes burning with anger. "Where's the boy you brought in today?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the lobby. The officer behind the counter jumped, adjusting his hat hastily. "Sir, everything is under control. There was a misunderstanding. The boy was trespassing on private property. He was reported by a neighbor," he tried to explain, but was interrupted by Charles. "I want to speak to Logan, now." Logan looked up at the familiar voice and saw Charles approaching in his wheelchair, his gaze determined. The old gentleman stopped in front of him and touched his shoulder gently. "Logan, I'm here." "Don't worry anymore," he said, his voice softer but still laden with tension. The boy couldn't hold back the tears that rolled down his face. "Mr. Charles, I didn't do anything," he whispered. Charles nodded, turning to the nearest officer. "I want this cleared up right now. This boy is under my protection," he declared with a firmness that made everyone around exchange uncomfortable glances. Hazel arrived at the station shortly after, accompanied by some curious neighbors who had heard the commotion. She found Charles staring at the officer in charge with an expression of contained fury. "Charles, I couldn't risk it. We don't know anything about this boy," she began, but was cut off by Charles's cutting look. "We don't know anything because people like you prefer to judge before asking. This boy saved me from losing something valuable and showed more honesty than many I know," he said, his voice tense. The neighbors whispered among themselves, agreeing with Hazel, others just watching in silence. Logan, still sitting, felt the weight of every look and every word. No matter what I do, I'll never be seen as an equal, he thought, clenching his trembling fists. Zoe appeared at the station door beside her mother, her eyes still red from crying. "Gentlemen, please let him go home," she implored, her thin voice full of despair. But her mother gave her a reproachful look, silencing her. Charles let out a sigh and looked at the officer. "You're going to release this boy now and end this charade. If there are legal consequences, I'll take full responsibility. This boy is my guest, not an intruder. He must be treated with respect," he stated without hesitation. The policeman nodded, visibly uncomfortable, and gave the order for Logan to be released. The boy rose slowly, feeling the stares fixed on his back. "Let's go home, Logan." "This matter is over," Charles said, placing his hand on his shoulder and indicating for him to follow his wheelchair. On the way back, the silence in the car was dense, only cut by Charles's heavy breathing. Logan looked out the window, trying to process everything that had happened. He defended me, but for how long will this last? He thought, feeling a mix of gratitude and insecurity. Charles finally broke the silence. "Don't let the cruelty of these people make you doubt who you are, Logan," he said, his voice low but firm. When they arrived at the mansion, Malcolm was waiting at the entrance with an expressionless face. "Sir, I hope everything has been resolved," he said in a tone that hid his satisfaction behind the words. Charles merely nodded, tired. Logan passed by Malcolm, feeling a chill run down his spine as he heard a malicious whisper. "You shouldn't have come back. This was just a warning." Later, as Logan walked through the garden to try to calm his mind, he heard familiar voices coming from the side veranda. Hazel and other neighbors were gathered, and the words were harsh. "It's a shame that Charles insists on keeping that boy here. It's going to devalue the neighborhood," said a man with a disdainful tone. Hazel immediately agreed. "Exactly. He doesn't belong in our world, and everyone knows it. We're going to end up being robbed or worse," she said. Logan backed away, his heart tight and his breath quickening. Every word was an invisible blow that made him feel smaller. "They'll never accept me. No matter what I do," he thought, his eyes watering. He looked up at the dark sky where only a few stars shone and made a silent decision. "I need to leave. This is not my place," he thought, as the sound of the voices still echoed. Hours later, the early morning hours enveloped the mansion in an almost absolute silence, interrupted only by the whisper of the wind that was starting to gain strength. Logan, with a heavy heart, sat on the edge of the small room he occupied. The decision to leave had already been made. He took a yellowed sheet of paper and with trembling hands wrote a note for Charles. "Mr. Charles, I can never thank you enough for what you've done for me, but I can no longer stay here. I don't want to cause any more problems. Thank you for everything, Logan." He carefully folded the note and left it on the pillow. "Sorry I have to do this, but it's for the best," he thought, his eyes full of tears. He took one last look at the simple room, feeling a pain he couldn't explain. It wasn't just fear, but the weight of gratitude mixed with the certainty that he didn't belong in that place. "I'll remember everything," he murmured before slowly opening the door and leaving behind the only home he had known for years. The mansion remained silent, with only the rustling of the curtains in the wind. Malcolm, who was watching from the shadows of a hallway, saw Logan walk away with a satisfied smile. "Finally, that boy knows what's best for him," he whispered, before turning and disappearing towards the servants' quarters. Logan carefully descended the stairs, the sound of the creaking steps echoing in his mind like a warning. "I can't hesitate. I need to go now," he thought, feeling the cold of the night increasing. Sometime later, Charles woke up with a strange sense of unease. He adjusted himself in bed and looked down the dimly lit hallway. Something seemed wrong. "Logan," he murmured, pushing the wheels of his chair and moving urgently down the hallway. When he reached the boy's room, the half-open door and the note on the pillow felt like a punch. "No, he can't have done this," he said aloud, picking up the paper with trembling hands. Reading the note, Charles felt the pain and frustration tighten his chest. "I should have seen this. I should have talked to him more," he thought, as he turned his chair and called for his driver. "Prepare the car immediately. We have to find Logan before it's too late," he shouted, his voice laden with despair. The driver appeared at the door, eyes wide at seeing Charles's urgency. "Yes, sir, I'll do it right away," he replied, running to prepare the vehicle. The storm was starting to form, lightning illuminating the sky, and the distant sound of thunder warning that a difficult night was to come. Charles got into the car with the driver's help, and they set off, the sound of the tires cutting through the thin rain that was starting to fall. "He can't be far away." "Logan is smart, but he's just a child," Charles said, his voice choked with worry. "I should never have let this happen," he thought, his gaze fixed on the wet road. Meanwhile, Logan walked through the dark city streets, feeling the cold wind lash his face. With each step, the rain increased, soaking his clothes and intensifying the cold. "Maybe it's a mistake. But I had no other choice," he thought, hugging his own body to try to keep warm. The streetlights cast shadows that made him feel even more vulnerable. Every sound, every movement around him seemed like a threat. "I can't go back. Even though at the mansion I had shelter and food, I can't give Charles trouble and cause him problems. I don't belong in that place," he repeated to himself, trying to keep his fear under control. The car of Charles crossed the streets quickly, and he looked out the window in search of any sign of Logan. The old man's heart was tight, and every second seemed like an eternity. "Please, turn there." "He may have headed towards that street," he said, pointing to a more distant avenue. The driver obeyed, and the rain began to fall harder, drumming on the roof of the car. "Logan, please be safe," he thought, his gaze lost in the darkness. At the mansion, Malcolm walked through the corridors, disguising his satisfaction. "That boy finally understood that he doesn't belong here," he muttered, looking out the window at the falling rain. He knew the storm would make any search attempt difficult. "Charles will never find him in this weather," he thought, a cold smile appearing on his lips. Logan, now completely soaked, sought shelter under a canopy, shivering uncontrollably. The noise of the storm frightened him, and the memory of the small room's comfort in the mansion seemed like a distant dream. "I need to find a safe place. I can't stay here," he thought, looking around. But the streets were deserted, and fear enveloped him like a cold blanket. "No matter what happens, I need to keep going," he said to himself, trying to hold on to hope. In the car, Charles felt the first wave of frustration. He could be anywhere. "And this rain. This won't help," he said, his voice failing for a moment. The driver looked through the rearview mirror, his expression tense. "We'll keep looking, sir. We won't give up," he replied, accelerating through the flooded streets. The thunders increased, and Logan felt a chill run down his spine. He needed to move before the rain brought him down. But as he took a step out from under the canopy, a lightning bolt lit up the street, revealing his frail, trembling figure. "I need to be strong. It's the only way," he thought as the storm threatened to engulf the city. Charles breathed deeply, struggling against the despair growing inside him. "Logan, where are you?" "Please be safe," he muttered, feeling the weight of responsibility on his chest. He knew that with the rain, every minute that passed meant greater danger for the boy lost in the cold streets. However, the storm raged with all its strength, making the streets look like rivers under the yellowish light of the lampposts. Charles, with his eyes fixed on the fogged-up window of the car, felt his heart tighten with anxiety. "Please, I want you to take me to that corner. That's where I first found Logan," he said, his voice marked by urgency. The driver obeyed, accelerating through the puddles that splashed water onto the sidewalks. The old man in his wheelchair inside the car tried to remain calm as the rain drummed harder on the roof. When they arrived at the spot, Charles caught sight of a small, drenched silhouette crouched under a canopy that offered little shelter. His heart leapt and he shouted, "There, he's there, stop the car!" The vehicle braked sharply and Charles opened the door with difficulty. "Logan, boy, it's all right, I'm here," he called, his voice laden with a mixture of relief and pain. Logan raised his face, his eyes wide and his expression marked by fear and surprise. Logan hesitated for a moment before getting up, his legs trembling with cold and fear. His wet face mingled with the tears he could no longer hold back. "Mr. Charles, I didn't want to cause any more trouble," he said, his voice low and choked. The old man extended his arms as far as he could. "You don't understand, boy. You were never a problem." "Come, let's go home," he insisted, his voice trembling slightly. The driver got out of the car and helped Logan in, wrapping him in a blanket that was on the back seat. Charles looked at the boy with eyes full of concern. "You're safe now. Why did you try to run away, Logan?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the emotion. Logan clutched the blanket to his body and averted his gaze. "I heard what they said. I don't belong here. So I'm just getting in the way," he confessed, his voice breaking into a sob. Charles felt a crushing weight on his chest. "They're wrong, Logan. You're stronger than you think, and they're afraid of that. But I'm on your side." "Never forget that," he said, moving as close as he could to hold the boy's hand. Logan looked at him, his eyes still clouded with sadness, but a spark of hope was beginning to emerge. "But what if I can't change anything?" he thought, feeling his heart tighten again. The car began to move back towards the mansion, and the sound of the heavy rain echoed like a constant drum. Charles looked out, the streetlights flashing by quickly. "We need to get back as fast as possible. This boy needs to rest and feel safe," he ordered, feeling the urgency grow. The driver nodded and stepped on the accelerator. Logan, now calmer, closed his eyes for a moment, trying to absorb Charles's words. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I can have a place," he thought, letting the weariness envelop him. As the car moved through the streets, Charles couldn't get the thoughts of everything Logan had faced out of his mind. "I let him feel helpless. That can't happen again," he reflected, the tension still etched on his face. The rain pounded against the windows so hard that the sound seemed to echo in his bones. How much cruelty can such a young heart endure before it breaks for good? He asked himself silently. On the opposite corner, inside a luxury car with tinted windows, Franklin, Charles's nephew, watched the scene with a disguised smile. He saw Logan get into the car and his uncle's worried expression. "So the old man is still determined to help this brat," he muttered, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. The tension in the air was palpable, and the storm only made the atmosphere heavier. "I won't let this boy infiltrate the family and take what is my rightful inheritance," he thought, before starting the engine and disappearing into the rainy night. The sound of Franklin's car engine mingled with the roar of thunder, and Charles, unaware of his nephew's presence, continued to hold Logan's hand, conveying a silent strength. "I'll never let them hurt you again, boy." "That's my promise," he thought, as the rain continued, relentlessly pounding against the car windows. Logan finally opened his eyes, looking at Charles with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Why do you care so much about me?" he asked, his voice still weak. Charles smiled, a tired but sincere smile. "Because I see in you the chance to make a difference, to give someone what I never had. You deserve more than they say," he replied. Logan took a deep breath, letting the words sink into his heart, warming him amidst the storm. Franklin, now parked in a dark corner of the street, watched with redoubled attention. The rain streamed down the window, distorting the view, but he could see enough. "That boy Vati won't be around for long," he thought, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. He knew this closeness between Charles and Logan could be an opportunity to turn the game in his favor. Charles looked at Logan again, squeezing his hand slightly. "Today is the end of fear, boy, and the beginning of something no one can take from you," he stated, feeling the resolution take hold of him. Logan nodded, still wary, but something in his words awakened a new kind of hope. "I'll try to believe that," he thought as the rain continued relentless, to witness that promise made amidst the storm. Minutes later, the mansion's door creaked open as the driver helped Charles in, followed by Logan, still wrapped in the wet blanket. The air was heavy with a weighted silence, broken only by the sound of Charles's wheelchair wheels and the splashes of rain dripping from Logan. "Come on, Logan, you need to rest," Charles said, his voice laden with a weariness that went beyond the physical. As Malcolm emerged from the hallway, Charles shot him a resolute look. "Malcolm, where was Logan sleeping?" he asked, his voice low. The butler hesitated but maintained his mask of indifference. "Sir, he was in the attic. I thought it would be most appropriate at the moment," he replied in a controlled tone. Charles's eyes narrowed and he gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. "In the attic? How dare you? This boy deserves a decent room. I want him settled into a guest room immediately. And if anything like this happens again, your position will be reconsidered," he said, anger seeping through every word. Malcolm lowered his head, but the glint of defiance in his eyes did not go unnoticed by Logan. "Yes, sir. I'll make arrangements right away," the butler responded with a slight inflection of irony. As he walked away, Charles looked at Logan, who was visibly distraught. "I'm sorry about that, kid. It won't happen again," he promised, Trying to convey reassurance amidst the uncertainties now looming over him, Logan remained silent, but his eyes reflected the weariness and pain of someone well acquainted with the world's cruelties. Malcolm, out of Charles's line of sight, stopped beside one of the older maids, who looked at him with disdain disguised as respect. "It's only a matter of time before he realizes who's really causing trouble here," he whispered with a slight smile. As he walked away, two young maids busy cleaning the hallway exchanged glances, and one of them muttered low enough for Logan to hear, "That boy has only brought problems since he arrived. He should go back to where he never should have left." Logan lowered his eyes, pretending not to have heard, but the impact of the words was felt. The lump in his throat tightened with every passing second. "Why did I think this would be different?" he questioned, swallowing hard. The following morning, as the shy sunlight filtered through the heavy mansion curtains, Charles was in his office reviewing documents. The front door creaked, and Franklin strode in with steady steps, his face stamped with a cynical smile. Malcolm greeted him with a discreet nod. "Mr. Franklin, we weren't expecting your visit so early," he said, his voice suggesting complicity. Franklin cast an evaluative glance around before responding. "Is Uncle Charles awake?" he asked, not waiting for an answer as he headed towards the living room where his uncle was. Charles looked up, tired but still imposing. "Franklin, what brings you here at this hour?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I heard your generosity is becoming problematic," Franklin said, his voice dripping with irony. Before Charles could respond, Malcolm entered with calculated steps, his demeanor serious. "Mr. Charles, I have something to report. Some objects from the house are going missing. Small things, but enough to cause concern." Charles frowned, feeling a growing tension. "Objects disappearing? What are you talking about, Malcolm?" he questioned, his voice firm but with a trace of worry. "Silver pieces from the dinner service, a statuette from your office. Things that wouldn't vanish without reason," Malcolm continued, casting a furtive glance at Franklin. The latter seized the opportunity. "Uncle, I understand you want to help, but are you being, naive? I heard you brought a street boy into this house. Those boys know how to adapt. What if Logan is just pretending to be innocent to gain your trust?" he suggested with a sly smile. The silence that followed was oppressive. Logan, passing by the hallway, stopped when he heard his name. His heart raced and the words felt as heavy as stones. "Do they really think that about me?" he thought, trying to control the tremor in his hands. Charles finally responded, his voice firm. "I know Logan, and I trust him. He wouldn't do that. But I'll keep an eye on him," he said, feeling doubt growing in his mind. "If this continues, I'll have no choice but to investigate further," he thought, as Franklin and Malcolm exchanged a silent agreement. The atmosphere in the mansion grew increasingly tense. Charles, despite maintaining a firm stance, couldn't shake the shadow of doubt that had loomed over him since Franklin and Malcolm's insinuations. Meanwhile, Logan, now settled in a guest room, tried to deal with the discomfort of being watched and judged at every step. "No matter what I do, I'll always be seen as a problem," he thought, clenching his fists as he stared at the ceiling. Malcolm, with a cold glint in his eyes, moved silently through the corridors. He had a plan to ensure Logan wouldn't remain under Charles' protection for much longer. In his hands, an antique and valuable pocket watch, a family heirloom Charles treasured. Without hesitation, he entered Logan's room while the boy was helping in the kitchen, slid the watch under the pillow, and left without a sound. "Let's see how he handles this," he muttered with a cynical smile. Franklin had been at the mansion since early in the day, observing the events with an attentive and intentional gaze. Malcolm, already aware of the plan, exchanged a complicit look with Franklin, their satisfaction evident on their faces. "Good afternoon, Mr. Franklin. I think we have something interesting," Malcolm whispered, a tone of satisfaction in his voice. "Excellent, let's get to work," Franklin replied, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He made his way down the hallway to the bedrooms and, without knocking, entered Logan's. The boy, who was returning from working in the kitchen, stopped abruptly when he saw Franklin and Malcolm in his space. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his thin voice trembling with confusion and fear. "Just checking some things out," said Franklin, his casual tone barely disguising his intent. He approached the bed and lifted the pillow with a firm hand. The watch glistened in the soft lamplight, and Franklin raised it into the air, displaying it as if it were proof of betrayal. Logan felt the blood freeze. I didn't put that there. I don't know how it ended up here," he exclaimed, his voice choked with despair. Malcolm raised an eyebrow and took a step back, feigning surprise. "Well, Mr. Charles will be disappointed," he said, the words sharp as knives. Franklin looked at Logan with an expression of false regret. "Do you have anything to say before we talk to my uncle? Being honest now might ease things," he suggested, but his tone betrayed the certainty of guilt. Downstairs, Charles heard the commotion and wheeled himself to Logan's room. When the door opened and he saw the watch in Franklin's hands, a mixture of shock and disappointment took over his face. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Uncle, we found the missing watch," said Franklin, his tone a mix of false compassion and triumph. Logan looked at Charles, his eyes wide and full of tears. "I didn't do it, Mr. Charles. Please believe me," he pleaded, his voice failing under the weight of injustice. The ensuing silence was like a blow. Charles looked at the watch and then at Logan's anguished face. He wanted to believe, but the planted evidence was too strong. Why is this happening now? So many coincidences, he thought, his heart heavy with doubt. Malcolm took a step forward, his expression solemn. "Sir, we must get to the bottom of this. The house cannot have such situations go unanswered," he said, making a gesture that suggested false solidarity. Charles averted his gaze, taking a deep breath to contain the anger and sorrow that mingled within him. Logan, unable to contain his despair, tried to explain himself once more. "I never stole anything. All I did was try to help and be honest," he said, his voice breaking into silent sobs. Franklin gave a slight smile, watching the scene as if he were a spectator at a theater. "And yet here's the watch," he said, in a tone that left no room for questioning. The corridor began to fill with servants whispering among themselves, exchanging looks of disapproval. "You can't trust boys like him," muttered one of the older maids, with a tight-lipped smile. Each word felt like a stab to Logan, who felt his strength ebbing away. The driver looked at Charles with an expression of solidarity, but said nothing, respecting the moment. Charles finally broke the silence, his voice lower than usual. "We'll get to the bottom of this. Until then, Logan, stay in your room," he said, the expression on his face a painful mixture of disappointment and confusion. As he left, Miguel wheeling him out of the room, Logan felt the door closing like a seal on a cruel fate. Franklin approached Malcolm when everyone had dispersed. "That was perfect. Now let's see how the old man deals with this," Franklin murmured, and Malcolm nodded, the two exchanging a smile that sealed their silent alliance. Logan, on the other side of the door, slid down the wall and hugged his knees as tears streamed down his face. "Why does it always end up like this?" he thought, feeling the darkness of the room reflect the emptiness within him. Meanwhile, Charles, in his wheelchair, tried to remain calm as he reviewed the recent events in his mind. Logan, isolated in his room, felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, still unable to comprehend how everything had gone so wrong. The silence was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up at the entrance. Hazel, the neighbor, accompanied by her daughter Zoe, arrived for an unexpected visit. Zoe got out of the car with a shy smile, but her eyes lit up at the sight of the neighbor's house she visited sporadically with her mother. As she entered, she immediately recognized Logan, and an expression of surprise and concern took over her face. "Mom, can I go see the garden?" she asked, trying to disguise her curiosity. Hazel, ever concerned with appearances, nodded with a distracted wave. "Yes, but don't be long, we have matters to attend to." As Zoe walked down the hallway, her curiosity led her close to the slightly ajar office door. She heard familiar voices and paused, peeking through a crack. Franklin and Malcolm were conversing in low tones, but not low enough for her not to hear. "It was easier than I thought to plant that watch. The boy didn't stand a chance to defend himself. Charles won't believe that beggar with evidence in his room that he stole. Soon this boy will be out of here," Malcolm said, a cruel smile forming on his lips. Zoe's eyes widened, her breathing quickening. "So they're accusing Logan of theft again. He didn't do anything. They're setting him up," she thought, feeling the urgency to tell someone. Her heart pounded as she heard Franklin respond, his tone one of satisfaction. "Charles will believe me. He's always preferred to ignore what was right in front of him if it meant protecting his idea of redemption." Before she could move away, Zoe heard footsteps drawing closer and backed up, but not quickly enough. Malcolm appeared at the door, and upon seeing her, his face hardened. "What are you doing here, girl?" he asked, his voice coming out in a low growl. Zoe tried to remain calm, but her expression betrayed her. "Nothing. I was just going to the garden," she replied, her eyes averting to avoid Malcolm's piercing gaze. Franklin approached with a curious and dangerous look. "Zoe, dear, it's dangerous to wander around here alone. Why don't you go back to your mother?" he suggested, but there was a weight to the words that made her swallow hard. I'll do that now," she said, trying to move, but Malcolm placed a hand on her shoulder, preventing her from proceeding. "Wait a minute. I think you've heard more than you should," Malcolm murmured, his cold eyes fixed on her. Zoe felt panic rising in her throat, but forced herself to keep her expression firm. "I didn't hear anything important, I swear," she replied, but her voice came out trembling. Franklin leaned towards her, the smile fading. "I hope you're telling the truth, because if not, we're going to have problems," he said, the threat clear in his tone. Zoe felt her legs weaken, but she knew she needed to warn Charles. "I need to be quick. He has to know," she thought as fear pulsed through every fiber of her body. Malcolm squeezed her shoulder a little tighter before letting go. "Remember, girl, sometimes it's better to forget what you've heard." "For your own good," he said in a tone that made Zoe's skin crawl. She took a step back, hesitant before turning and quickly walking down the hallway. Hazel, who was busy chatting with one of the maids, noticed her daughter returning with a pale face. "Zoe, what happened? Are you okay?" she asked, frowning. Zoe hesitated, looking at her mother and then at the stairs leading to Charles's room. "I'm fine, Mother. I need to speak with Mr. Charles," she replied without explaining further. Franklin and Malcolm exchanged a wary glance, and without Hazel noticing, Malcolm followed Zoe, his expression one of grim determination. "She can't get to Charles. That girl is going to ruin everything," he thought. His eyes fixed on her as he quickened his pace, ready to intercept her before she could speak to Charles. Zoe felt a chill run down her spine and quickened her steps, determined to reveal what she had heard before it was too late. Zoe ran through the mansion's corridors, her heart racing as she heard Malcolm's firm footsteps approaching. When she reached Charles's bedroom door, she knocked urgently. "Mr. Charles, I need to speak with you," she shouted, her voice trembling with fear. On the other side, Charles looked at the door with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Open the door, please," he asked as he adjusted himself in his wheelchair. Zoe, panting, entered the room, her eyes wide and her expression terrified. "Zoe, what's happening?" Charles asked, his voice gentle but laced with worry. Zoe approached, trying to catch her breath. "I overheard Malcolm. He and Franklin were talking about how they planted the clock in Logan's room. They did it on purpose to frame him," she said, the words coming out quick and anxious. Charles's expression hardened and his eyes narrowed. "Are you sure about what you're saying, Zoe?" he asked, but the vehemence in her gaze made him realize there was no mistake. Before he could say anything else, Malcolm appeared at the door, his face twisted into a cold expression. "Sir, is something wrong?" he asked, but the tension in his voice betrayed his nervousness. "Close the door, Malcolm." "We need to talk," Charles said, his voice firm as he hadn't been in a long time. He obeyed, and the silence that followed was so dense it seemed the air had turned to glass, ready to shatter at any moment. "Malcolm, explain yourself." "Zoe overheard your conversation with Franklin. Planting evidence, setting up against Logan. I want the truth, and I want it now," Charles demanded, his tone as sharp as a razor. Malcolm remained silent for a moment, his dark eyes fixed on Charles before letting out a short, bitter laugh. "Truth, sir. The truth is that boy doesn't belong here. People like him only bring trouble." "I thought I was protecting what's left of this house's dignity," Malcolm said, contempt dripping from every word. Zoe gasped at the direct confession, and Miguel clenched his fists, ready to intervene if necessary. Charles felt anger bubbling in his veins. "Dignity? You dare speak of dignity while conspiring to ruin an innocent child's life?" "I will not tolerate this kind of behavior," he replied, his face marked by disappointment and restrained fury. At that moment, Franklin entered the room, drawn by the raised voices. "Uncle, what's going on here?" he asked in a tone that tried to sound concerned but was unconvincing. Charles turned his wheelchair to face his nephew, his piercing eyes fixed on him. What's happening is that the truth has come out, Franklin. You and Malcolm planted evidence to frame Logan. Do you have nothing to say in your defense? Franklin maintained a serene expression, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his apparent calm. Uncle, this is a misunderstanding. Malcolm may have acted on his own, but I only tried to protect you from a potentially dangerous situation, he said, momentarily averting his gaze towards Zoe, who glared at him angrily. Don't hide behind lies, Franklin, Zoe said, her voice small but firm. Franklin scoffed, his face contorting into a scowl of impatience. You're just a child. You don't know what you're talking about. Charles raised one hand, asking for silence. I don't need to hear anything more. Malcolm, pack your things, you're fired. And Franklin, I'm not done with you yet, he said, his voice laden with an authority he hadn't displayed in years. Malcolm's face paled, but his eyes still shone with a last flicker of apprehension. Malcolm took a step forward, his eyes filled with desperation. Please, sir, I beg your forgiveness. I cannot lose this job. I did what I did out of misguided loyalty, but I promise I will never bother Logan again or cause any more trouble, he said, his voice trembling and pleading. Charles took a deep breath, observing Malcolm with a stern and calculated gaze. I'll allow you to stay, Malcolm, but understand that this is your last chance. If I find out about any other attitude against Logan, you'll be out of here forever, he said, his voice firm and resolute. Franklin remained silent, his lips set in a thin line as Charles stared at him with the same intensity. Zoe, thank you for having the courage to speak up. You did the right thing, he said, looking at the girl with a broad smile of gratitude. She nodded, her eyes still shining with determination. When Charles walked away, the weight of the recent revelation still hung in the air. Zoe remained in the hallway watching Franklin, who was heading towards the end of the corridor where Malcolm was standing, his expression somber. Franklin approached, his lips moving in an almost inaudible whisper. We need to move faster. He's more alert than we expected. Malcolm nodded, his piercing gaze meeting Franklin's. Don't worry, I have an idea that will ensure he has no control over anything anymore, he replied, his voice laced with malice. Zoe shuddered, catching only fragments, but enough to know that something dangerous was afoot. Logan, who had cautiously approached the hallway, stopped upon hearing the conspiratorial voices. He didn't want to be seen, but he needed to understand what they were plotting. The boy's breathing quickened as he heard Franklin mention an asylum. He no longer has the capacity to make the best decisions for himself. Committing him is the most sensible choice, Franklin said, his voice cold and calculated. Logan's heart raced. They want to take Mr. Charles away from here. To an asylum, he thought, the realization hitting him with a mix of horror and despair. He couldn't let that happen. He knew that without Charles, his fate would be more than sealed. Zoe noticed Logan there, his eyes wide with the discovery. She gestured discreetly for him to move away before they were noticed, and he obeyed, retreating into the shadows of the hallway. We need to think of something. We can't let this happen, Logan whispered to himself, his mind spinning with possibilities. Meanwhile, Charles sat in his wheelchair, his thoughts swirling like a storm in his mind. The silence of the mansion seemed to amplify the weight of his reflections. He looked at the glass of water on the table and ignored it, lost in recent memories that troubled him. The image of Logan, his eyes filled with pain and despair, made his chest tighten. How could I doubt him even for a moment, he thought, as guilt gnawed at his defenses. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders. Logan deserves more than this. I need to ensure he knows I trust him, and that I will protect him from any schemes Franklin and Malcolm try to hatch, he murmured to himself, his voice thick with the weight of circumstances. The disappointment in his own judgments made him retrace every word and every decision made in the past few days. The atmosphere was charged with a silent expectation, as if the very walls awaited his next action. Charles knew he couldn't allow himself any more doubts. With renewed determination, he decided he would do whatever it took to re-establish trust between him and the boy. Nothing will take Logan away from what he deserves, not lies, not manipulations. Logan has already proven to me that he is a good boy, that he is honest and has a good heart. I cannot allow people to poison me against him, he promised in a whisper, as his gaze hardened with the force of his decision. Charles was lost in his thoughts about the decision he had made when a loud knock at the door brought him back to reality. Come in, he said, bracing himself for the visit. Hazel entered, her strong perfume and confident posture making her discomfort clear. "Mr. Charles, I hope you are well. I came to ask if tomorrow's event is still happening," Hazel said, her voice calm but laced with concern. She looked around with a critical gaze. "It's an important event and certain presences may tarnish the image of the night. You know influential people don't accept surprises. Don't you think this could deter support?" Charles gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, holding Hazel's gaze firmly. "Hazel, I believe you're referring to Logan, correct? I understand events like these need a good image, but I won't sacrifice a boy's dignity for convenience. If he is in my house, it's because I trust him. If that's a problem for some, perhaps they need to reevaluate their values, not mine." Hazel raised her eyebrows, surprised by the response, but persisted. "Mr. Charles, it's not prejudice, it's precaution. People can be cruel and distort facts. I'm just thinking about your safety and keeping things in order. Logan could change everything." Charles sighed, but his gaze grew even more resolute. "If maintaining that order means going against what I believe in, then I'd rather have things change. Logan deserves more than being judged by those who never tried to know him. If he's seen as a problem, so be it. I'd rather be honest than pretend. We're talking about a charity event. It's strange that they have such a prejudiced view, since we're donating to help noble causes. But I've always believed these events were motivated by other things, except helping others." Hazel fell silent for a moment, visibly uncomfortable with Charles's response. She let out a sigh and shook her head. "I hope this decision doesn't have consequences, sir. Just remember, not everyone shares your generous view." She turned and walked to the door, the firm sound of her heels echoing through the room. She paused for a moment as if to add something else, but thought better of it. With one last concerned look, she left, closing the door with a soft click. Charles watched the door close and felt a weight in his chest. The conversation had left him tense but determined. These people never change, he thought, as he mentally prepared himself for the challenges of the approaching event. The next day, the mansion was a bustle of servants and decorations being adjusted. The main hall gleamed with crystal chandeliers and immaculately set tables. Logan, in a suit that seemed too large for him, stood near the entrance observing the commotion with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. Malcolm eyed him sideways, his face impassive, but with a satisfied glint in his eyes. "Today is an important day, boy, don't mess it all up," Malcolm said, his voice dripping with cynicism. Logan swallowed hard, feeling a knot forming in his stomach. He hadn't received any guidance on how to behave and feared what could go wrong. The guests began to arrive, dressed in elegant clothes and bearing calculated smiles. Each one who passed by Logan looked at him with curiosity, some with veiled disdain. A middle-aged woman with jewels that glistened under the light stopped and stared at him. "Who is this? Does Charles have a new servant now?" she said, laughing with sarcasm. Logan blushed, but kept his gaze steady, unsure whether to respond or move away. "I don't belong in this place," he thought, trying to ignore the woman's contemptuous gaze. Malcolm, who was standing beside him, gave an almost imperceptible smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats," announced one of the servants, and everyone followed to their tables. Logan stayed behind, hesitant, until a cold, cutting voice came from a tall man in a dark suit. "Are you going to stand there blocking the way?" he asked, in a tone that made Logan shrink his shoulders. "Sorry, sir," he muttered, moving quickly to avoid causing any inconvenience. Malcolm watched every move, ready to revel in any mistake. The dinner began, and amidst the murmur, Logan was called to sit at a side table, away from the spotlight. Charles looked at him from time to time, trying to convey confidence with his gaze. But the boy's nervousness was evident. A waiter placed a plate in front of him, and Logan looked at it doubtfully, unsure which utensil to use. "Are you going to eat or admire the food?" whispered a woman beside him, with a tone of contempt that made others laugh discreetly. Logan felt his face burn, picking up any fork and committing the first mistake. The sound of muffled laughter spread across the table. "What kind of child doesn't know how to use a utensil?" commented another guest, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Logan tried to concentrate on the food, but the words were like needles piercing his confidence. Logan dropped a utensil on the floor, and the sound echoed louder than he expected. A shrill laugh came from the other side of the room, followed by whispers. "This boy is a disaster," said a mustachioed man, shaking his head. The boy took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to surface. I won't cry. Not here, he thought, lifting his chin and struggling to maintain his composure. Malcolm approached, pretending to arrange something on the table. Looks like you shouldn't be here, huh? He whispered, with a cynical smile before walking away. Logan felt the world around him become smaller, more suffocating. One of the guests, a lady in a golden embroidered dress, looked at Logan with disdain. Where did Charles find this boy? Looks like he doesn't even know how to hold a glass, she said, as she sipped her wine with indifference. Others around agreed with murmurs of contempt. Logan, trying to recompose himself, picked up the water glass, but his trembling hands caused some of the liquid to spill onto the table. The look of censure was immediate. Oh, look! Even drinking is a challenge for him, mocked a young couple, laughing in a restrained manner. Why are they treating me so badly? Don't they see that I'm trying to adjust? That I didn't have the same education as them, but that I can learn? Thought Logan, his heart beating erratically. He wished the night would end soon, that he could disappear from that table of sharp looks. More laughter echoed when one of the servants passed by and deliberately bumped Logan's chair slightly, causing him to lose his balance. Sorry, boy, he said in a tone bordering on sarcasm. Logan adjusted himself, but the humiliation coursed through his entire body. The dinner continued its course, but the tension in the air was almost palpable. Logan, with trembling hands and a downcast gaze, tried to remain invisible, while the laughter and conversations around echoed like murmurs that excluded him. He could barely swallow the food, each movement too careful, each mistake a chance for more looks of contempt. It was then that one of the guests, a burly man wearing an impeccable suit, leaned over subtly and spilled a portion of food directly onto Logan's lap. The hot liquid ran down the boy's leg, and the shock made him choke with a muffled gasp. The man smiled with disdain, feigning surprise. Oh, how clumsy. Looks like he can't even eat, he said with a false laugh that spread among other guests. Logan felt his face burn, tears threatening to escape as he tried to clean his clothes with trembling hands. The hall fell into an uncomfortable silence for a moment, until Charles, who watched everything with cold, angry eyes, broke the silence. Enough, said Charles, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. All eyes turned to him, some surprised, others disconcerted. Is this how we treat our fellow human beings? Is this the example we want to set? Logan is a guest in this house, and no one, absolutely no one, has the right to humiliate him. The man who had spilled the food tried to justify himself, but his voice faltered. Sir Charles, it was just an accident. I didn't mean to offend, he said, but the ironic smile on his lips belied his words. Charles fixed his gaze on Logan, who now looked at him with eyes shining with shame and relief. Don't worry, boy. They don't know who you really are, he said, and then turned again to the guests. I see many here who forget where they came from, who judge without knowing others' stories. Let me tell you something about myself. The hall fell silent again, this time respectfully. Charles continued, his voice now softer but filled with intensity. I was not born in this mansion, nor surrounded by luxury. I grew up in a modest home, where my mother sewed to support the family and my father worked from sun-up to sundown. I know what it is to be looked down upon, to be treated as inferior. And I know the value of an act of kindness, he said, looking at each of the guests who averted their eyes, ashamed. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, trying to avoid the weight of Charles's words. Logan listened attentively, absorbing every word with a lump in his throat. For the first time, he felt he wasn't alone in that room full of strangers. Do you think wealth and status give someone the right to humiliate others? I say no. What matters is character, the courage to face the world without losing dignity, Charles continued, his voice echoing through the hall. Some faces flushed, and murmurs of discomfort spread. A woman in a golden embroidered dress, who had previously looked at Logan with disdain, lowered her gaze and nervously fidgeted with her napkin. The mustachioed man who had caused the scene stared at his own plate, unable to face the host. Charles didn't stop. If you think a house full of luxury is enough to measure a man's worth, you are mistaken. My success was not built at the expense of others, but with hard work and respect. Logan is part of this house, and I will not accept him being treated as anything less, he declared firmly. his voice resonating with conviction. Logan felt a different warmth in his chest, a mixture of pride and hope. Charles was there, defending him in a way he never imagined anyone would. The whispers ceased, replaced by a heavy silence. It was then that Franklin, who was sitting next to other relatives, abruptly stood up. "Uncle, this is going too far. We're here for an event, not sermons," he said, his voice laden with irritation. The sudden movement caused a folder he was holding to slip from his hands and fall next to Logan. All eyes turned to the fallen object, and Franklin himself belatedly realized he had exposed something. He quickly bent down to pick up the documents, but Logan, faster, looked at the scattered papers. "What is this?" Logan asked, more to himself, but loud enough for some to hear. Franklin turned pale, his fingers trembling as he collected the folder. "None of your business, boy," he growled, trying to maintain his composure. Charles, attentive, observed the interaction with a glint of suspicion in his eyes. "Franklin, what's going on here?" he asked, his voice still firm, but with a hint of curiosity. Franklin pursed his lips and stood up, holding the folder close to his chest. "Nothing to worry about, Uncle, just work documents," he replied, but his voice faltered slightly, enough to raise suspicions. Logan, still feeling his heart pounding, looked at Charles and then at Franklin. Something in his mind told him those papers meant more than mere paperwork. But the hall, once silent, began to stir again, with guests murmuring, distracted by the interruption. The event continued, but the tension lingered like a charged cloud over everyone. Logan felt there were still more things to follow, and secrets that would soon come to light. The next morning, Logan, still restless from the events of the previous night, decided to explore the house to calm his mind. He walked through the wide corridors, his curious eyes roaming over the paintings and antique furniture that seemed to tell forgotten stories. As he passed an ajar door, he realized it was the guest room where Franklin usually stayed when visiting the mansion. Logan's heart raced. An impulse made him enter the silent room, which exuded a faint scent of expensive perfume. His eyes soon caught sight of the brown leather folder on the table. It was the same one Franklin had dropped the night before. Logan hesitated for a moment, but curiosity prevailed. With trembling hands, he opened the folder and found a stack of documents. What could he be hiding, he thought as he flipped through the pages. His eyes widened as he saw a statement describing plans to declare Charles incapable of caring for his business and assets. Franklin's signature at the end was a confirmation of his betrayal. It can't be. He wants to take everything from Mr. Charles, he whispered, his voice trembling with fear and anger. He knew he needed to tell the millionaire, but first he had to understand more about what was happening. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound in the hallway. Malcolm appeared at the door, his face marked by lines of regret. "What are you doing here, boy?" he asked in a less severe tone than usual. Logan, with the folder in his hands, looked at him, unsure whether he should trust him. "I saw these documents, Malcolm. Franklin wants to declare Mr. Charles incapable." "Is this true?" he asked, his gaze defiant, but with a glimmer of hope that it was all a mistake. Malcolm closed his eyes and let out a heavy sigh. "Yes, it's true. I shouldn't have let things get this far. I was judging you and I got too involved in this. I almost lost my job, but Franklin has been planning this for days," he confessed, his voice bitter. "But now it's not safe for you or Mr. Charles." Logan felt a chill run down his spine. He needed to act, but how? "What can we do then?" "I can't let this happen," he said, his voice filled with unexpected courage. Before Malcolm could respond, they both heard the sound of tires on the gravel at the entrance. Logan ran to the window and saw Franklin getting out of a luxury car, followed by an ambulance and 2 doctors in white coats. Franklin's demeanor was cold, his eyes fixed on the entrance of the mansion. "He's come to get Mr. Charles. He's going to try to have him committed as if it were for his safety," Malcolm muttered, his eyes fixed on the scene outside. "I need to get out of here and warn Charles now," he finished, pushing Logan toward the door. Logan ran down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew every second counted. He quickly descended the stairs, and upon reaching the main hall found Charles conversing with one of the servants. "Mr. Charles, it's urgent. Franklin brought an ambulance and doctors. He's going to try to take you out of the house," Logan said, breathless but with a firm voice. Charles looked at the boy, confusion turning into a mix of anger and understanding. "Logan, What are you talking about? This is absurd, he said, but Logan's expression and the boy's alarmed tone made him hesitate. Where's Franklin? He asked, now with more attentive eyes. Before he could get an answer, Franklin came through the main door, his authoritative voice filling the hall. Uncle, please keep your composure. The doctors are here to evaluate your health. It's just a routine procedure, he said, but the glint in his eyes betrayed his true intentions. Charles gripped the armrests of his wheelchair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I don't need any examination, Franklin. And certainly not an ambulance in my house without prior notice, he replied, his voice laden with mistrust. The doctors exchanged quick glances, unsure if they should intervene. Franklin took a step forward, trying to maintain his calm. Uncle, it's for your own good. We're all concerned about your safety. Let's make things easy, he said, but the tension on his face was clear. Logan felt Franklin's gaze land on him, like a sharp knife. Don't let him take you, Mr. Charles. Please trust me, Logan pleaded, moving closer and holding the millionaire's hand. Franklin narrowed his eyes, his patience wearing thin. You shouldn't be here, boy, he said, his voice laden with threat. But Charles, sensing Logan's loyalty and sincere fear, didn't back down. If there's anything to be discussed about my health, it will be on another occasion, and not with an ambulance parked in front of my house, Charles declared, his eyes fixed on Franklin, who was now speechless but clearly furious. The tension was palpable in the mansion. Charles was surrounded by a silence laden with expectation when Franklin entered the room accompanied by 2 doctors and a court officer. In the officer's hand, a court order gleamed like a weapon. Franklin, with a restrained and calculated smile, raised his head and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Uncle, it's just to ensure your safety. A quick evaluation to make sure everything is in order. I believe we all want what's best for you, Franklin said, his tone laden with false compassion. Charles gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his eyes flashing with anger. What's best for me? I don't need a forced evaluation, Franklin. This is an insult, he replied, his voice steady but tinged with disgust. The doctors exchanged glances, hesitant, but the officer stepped forward, holding up the court order. Mr. Charles, we have an order to proceed with the evaluation. I ask for your cooperation, he said, with a tone that tried to be professional but was cold. Before Charles could respond, Logan, who had been watching it all with wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and courage, saw the folder in Franklin's hands and felt a wave of determination. With a quick motion, he grabbed the folder and opened it, letting the documents fall onto the table. The paper revealed exorbitant figures and diversions that left no doubt about Franklin's intentions. What is this? Asked one of the doctors, his eyes wide as he saw the documents. The silence grew thicker, almost suffocating. Franklin lost his composure for a moment, his face turning red with anger. This is not relevant. These papers are mine and have nothing to do with this matter, he shouted, but his voice faltered. Charles leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the scattered papers. Financial diversions from my companies. So that was it. You were planning to take me out of the game to steal everything I've built, he said, with a tone that mixed anger and sadness. The betrayal seemed to weigh on every word. The silence that followed was tense. Franklin looked around, seeing the gazes that once respected him now filled with mistrust and contempt. He clenched his fists, trying to hold back the anger that simmered beneath his skin. You'll regret this, Uncle. You'll all regret this, Franklin said, his eyes flashing with hatred. But before he could leave, one of the doctors stepped forward, slowly and deliberately, tearing the court order to shreds. We won't be a part of this. It's clear we were called under false pretenses, the doctor said, throwing the pieces of paper on the floor. His courageous attitude caused a murmur of relief to echo through the hall. Charles closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that bitter victory. When he opened them, he saw Logan, who looked at him with hopeful and fearful eyes. The boy was trembling, but the determination in his gaze was clear. The silence in the room was broken by Charles' firm voice. He raised his hand and said in a tone that didn't allow for questioning, "Call the police." The servants looked at each other, hesitating for only a moment before one of them hurried out to make the call. Franklin, his face still contorted with rage, took a step back but couldn't contain a bitter smile. "Oh, you're making a big mistake, Uncle. You'll regret this," he repeated, but his voice now sounded more desperate than threatening. Charles kept his gaze fixed on Franklin, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "You don't understand, Franklin. A man's greatest failure is betraying the trust of those who sustain him. I trusted you as a nephew, as part of this family, and you betrayed not only me but everyone who depends on this house and this inheritance. This is something I cannot and will not forgive." The murmurs increased as Malcolm stepped back, visibly shaken. He knew his involvement in the plot had come to an end. Charles's voice echoed again, firm and with a clarity that made everyone fall silent. "I remember the day when a humble boy, with nothing but honesty and a desire to do the right thing, returned a briefcase full of money to me. Logan, a boy many of you despised and judged without even knowing him, showed me the true value of integrity. He who had nothing chose to do the right thing. And while he maintains his dignity, you who have always had everything chose betrayal," Charles said, his voice taking on a more emotional tone. Logan's eyes filled with silent tears. He couldn't look away from Charles, feeling a mixture of gratitude and fear of what was to come. Franklin tried to intervene again, but Charles raised his hand, silencing him with a gesture. "You, Franklin, used the family as a shield for your selfish and greedy plans. And you, Malcolm, who allowed yourself to be swayed by the promise of something that would never bring you true satisfaction. You both forgot that the foundation of any house, any family, is loyalty. And when that is destroyed, everything crumbles," Charles continued, his eyes sparking with an intensity that silenced any response. One of the servants returned to announce that the police were on their way. Malcolm looked at Charles, his eyes pleading, "Sir, I know I was wrong, but please don't send me away." "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this," he pleaded, his voice trembling. Franklin let out a sarcastic laugh. "You think that's going to solve anything? You're making a mistake, Uncle. The world isn't fair to those who hesitate," he taunted, trying to maintain a defiant stance. Charles stared at him for a moment, before responding coldly, "The world may not be fair, but it's up to us to do what's right, even when it's difficult. And today, Franklin, you lost your last chance to show you had something good in you." The doors opened and the police officers entered the room. "Mr. Charles, we received your call," one of the officers said. Charles nodded and pointed to Franklin and Malcolm. "Take these men away. They have a lot to explain about the crimes committed here." As the officers handcuffed Franklin, he turned to Charles with a look of pure hatred. "You'll pay for this, Uncle. All of you will pay," he threatened. But his voice was muffled by the sound of the handcuffs closing. The hall returned to silence as Franklin and Malcolm were led away. Charles took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. He looked at Logan and saw in the boy the same courage that had inspired him from the beginning. "True strength comes from doing what's right, Logan. Never forget that," he said, letting the words echo through the room as a lasting reminder. "Thank you, Mr. Charles. I'll never forget," Logan replied, his eyes shining with hope and determination. The next morning, the routine at the mansion, still shaken by recent events, was suddenly interrupted by a piercing scream that echoed through the gardens and reached the walls of the house. Charles, in his office, felt a chill run down his spine. Before he could call for help, Logan appeared at the door, his eyes wide and full of concern. "Mr. Charles, I heard a scream. It seems to be coming from Mrs. Hazel's house," Logan said, his breathing quickened. Charles, tense, nodded. "Go see what's happening, but be careful," he replied, his voice firm but laden with apprehension. Logan ran through the corridors of the mansion and crossed the side gate that led to the neighbor's house. As he approached the pool, he saw Zoe struggling in the water, her hands rising and falling as she fought to keep her head above water. Hazel was at the edge, desperate, screaming for help as the servants looked on in stunned silence, paralyzed by shock. "Someone please help. She's going to drown. I can't swim," Hazel cried, her trembling hands reaching out toward her daughter but unable to do anything. Without hesitation, Logan jumped into the pool. The cold water enveloped him like a blade, and for a moment his heart raced with fear, but he swam resolutely toward Zoe. "Hold on to me, I'll save you," he shouted, trying to keep his voice calm as he held the coughing and choking girl, her eyes wide with panic. "Help her, for God's sake," one of the servants insisted, finally snapping out of inertia and running to fetch a towel. Other guests who had been watching from afar quickly approached, whispering among themselves about the unexpected bravery of the boy many had despised. The crowd watched in silence, each second dragging on like an eternity. Logan mustered all his strength and guided Zoe to the edge, feeling his arms tremble with the effort. With difficulty, he lifted the girl out of the pool, where Hazel pulled her into a tight embrace, sobbing with relief and emotion. "My God, you saved my daughter," she whispered, her voice broken by tears. But Zoe remained motionless, her eyes closed and her face pale. Hazel, panicked, began to shake her gently. "Zoe, dear, open your eyes. Please, wake up," she implored, desperation growing. Logan approached quickly, his face still wet and his hands trembling. "She needs help. I saw in a book how to do this," he said, with a mixture of fear and determination. Before anyone could stop him, he gently pressed Zoe's chest and began chest compressions, counting softly. 1, 2, 3. The crowd held their breath as Logan continued. Hazel watched with wide eyes, not daring to intervene. After a few seconds that felt like hours, Zoe coughed and expelled water, gasping for breath. "She's back, thank God she's back," said a woman in the crowd, tears streaming down her face. Hazel hugged Zoe tighter, sobbing uncontrollably. "Thank you, Logan, thank you," she repeated, unable to contain the gratitude that flooded her. Logan, still panting, felt the chill of the water penetrate his bones. He looked around, his legs weak, and tried to stand up. The growing murmur of the neighbors increased, now filled with surprise and remorse. A lady who had previously avoided Logan stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears. "Forgive me, boy. We were so unfair to you," she said, her voice low and ashamed. I just did what anyone should do," Logan replied, his voice choked with emotion. He tried to process the adrenaline that was still coursing through his veins, while feeling now different looks upon him, no longer of disdain, but of recognition. Hazel, still holding Zoe, looked up at Logan, her eyes filled with tears and remorse. "I was wrong about you. I let prejudice blind me. Please forgive me," she said, her voice eager. Her lips trembled, and it was evident that every word came laden with regret and sincerity. "Logan, you saved her life. That cannot be ignored," commented a man in a suit, who until then had remained distant. The other neighbors nodded, and the murmur turned into a wave of whispered apologies and gratitude. "How blind we were," muttered an elderly woman, rubbing her hands nervously. At that moment, a low, dry noise echoed through the garden. Charles, who had been brought to the scene in his wheelchair, was pale, with his hand pressed to his chest. His face was contorted, and his breath came in short, shallow gasps. A sudden fear gripped those present. "Mr. Charles!" Logan shouted, his heart racing again, but this time with fear. He ran to Charles, who tried to open his mouth to speak, but only a faint sigh came out. Hazel looked at the man, and without hesitating shouted, "Call an ambulance, now!" "Please help him," Logan insisted, feeling tears well up in his eyes as he held Charles's hand, which was trembling slightly. The tension in the air became almost palpable. The servants moved in a controlled frenzy, and one of the guests used his cell phone to call for help. Logan held Charles's hand, now damp with cold sweat, and the boy's eyes filled with tears. "Please, stay with us." "You can't leave us now," Logan said, his voice trembling. The helplessness in his words formed a lump in his throat. Charles, with difficulty, forced a weak smile. "You're strong, Logan. Never forget that," he whispered, the words barely audible. His eyes, once filled with determination, now blinked, trying to focus on the boy's frightened expression. "They're coming, sir. Hold on," said one of the servants, but his words sounded empty amid the collective despair. Hazel, with Zoe still embraced, watched Charles with eyes filled with guilt and renewed understanding. "He saved my daughter. How could we have been so blind? How could I have failed to see that he was just a child, just like her?" she thought, feeling the hot tears stream down her face. Logan's expression, holding Charles's hand with all his might, reflected the determination not to let that moment become a farewell. The sound of approaching sirens brought a new layer of urgency. The neighbors, who had previously been distant and judgmental, now watched with concern. A visible transformation hovered over everyone, a mixture of fear and remorse they had never felt before. The rigid expressions softened, and the whispers stopped as the paramedics rushed through the gates of the mansion. Logan, still holding Charles's hand tightly, looked into the older man's eyes, who was trying to remain conscious. "You're here. You're going to be okay," he murmured, almost like a plea. Charles, though weak, smiled encouragingly, a glimmer of gratitude appearing in his tired eyes. The paramedics hurried, carefully moving Charles onto a stretcher while Logan watched, his heart tight with worry and hope. "Please, take care of him." "He means everything to this house," said Hazel, tears still wetting her face, her voice more human than ever. The neighbors, one by one, approached to comfort Logan and express words of support, finally recognizing the boy's courage. A tall, gray-haired man slightly bent and touched Logan's shoulder. "Boy, today you taught us more than we could have imagined," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Thank you, sir," Logan replied, his voice still trembling and his gaze fixed on the ambulance. Without a second thought, Logan took a few hurried steps, reaching the paramedics. "Can I go with him?" "Please, he needs me," they pleaded, their voice heavy with hope and fear. The paramedic exchanged a glance with Hazel, who nodded silently, still embracing Zoe. "You're special, Logan." "Never let anyone tell you otherwise," added a woman in a blue dress, her eyes reddened from tears. The boy merely nodded, unable to find words amid the emotions that overwhelmed him. As the ambulance drove away, the sound of sirens fading, Logan felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Charles needed all the strength he and the house could offer. The journey to the hospital was marked by a dense and suffocating atmosphere. Logan sat beside Charles in the ambulance, his eyes fixed on the pale face of the man who was now his only family. The paramedics worked quickly, checking vital signs and administering oxygen, but the tension was almost unbearable. Suddenly, one of the monitors emitted a shrill, incessant tone. "We've lost the pulse," shouted the paramedic, while another immediately began chest compressions. Logan felt the world spin around him, the sound of the monitor echoing in his ears like a terrible omen. "No, you have to hold on. Please, Mr. Charles," Logan murmured, holding the man's cold hand and feeling tears run down his face. The scene around him was a blur of rapid movements and urgent voices. The paramedic performing chest compressions exchanged a glance with the other, and Logan sensed the gravity of the situation. "Come on, Charles. Don't give up now," he whispered, gripping the man's hand even tighter as if he could transmit strength to him. "Prepare for shock," ordered the paramedic, positioning the defibrillator paddles on Charles's chest. Logan recoiled, his heart racing with terror. The first shock made Charles's body briefly arch, but the monitor continued emitting its piercing tone. "Again!" insisted the paramedic, increasing the tension in the ambulance. Logan covered his mouth with his hands, trying to contain the sob that threatened to burst out. He couldn't imagine life without Charles. Hope, even if fragile, was the only thing keeping him standing at that moment. A second shock was administered, and after a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, the monitor finally emitted a rhythmic beep. "We have a pulse," said the paramedic, letting out a sigh of relief that echoed among everyone present. Logan let out a tear of hope, but he still felt the overwhelming weight of uncertainty. "You came back, Mr. Charles. Hold on, please," Logan whispered, his voice now trembling and choked. The ambulance gained speed, and the city landscape passed quickly and blurred through the window, reflecting the urgency of the situation. When they arrived at the hospital, the medical team was already waiting, ready to receive Charles. Logan was gently pushed aside as the paramedics and doctors exchanged quick and precise information. "Male, 68 years old, cardiac arrest reversed in the field, critical condition," said one of the paramedics. Logan tried to follow Charles, but a nurse stopped him, putting her hand on his shoulder. "You need to wait here, boy. We'll do our best," she said in a gentle but firm tone. The boy nodded, feeling helplessness gnaw at his chest. "Please save him," Logan whispered as the emergency room door closed before his eyes. He sat on a plastic chair in the waiting room, his whole body trembling with anxiety. The hospital corridor was lit by cold white lights, and the distant sound of footsteps and voices created an unsettling echo. Minutes dragged like hours. Logan looked at the people passing by, some with expressions of haste, others of concern. No one there knew what he felt, the mixture of fear and hope that gripped his heart. "He has to be okay, he's all I have," Logan thought, his hands clasped in silent prayer. He felt a tear trickle down his face, but he didn't care to wipe it away. Suddenly, a doctor emerged from the emergency room, his expression serious and focused. He exchanged glances with Logan for an instant, but said nothing before heading to the phone at the reception desk. Logan stood up quickly, his heart pounding like a drum. "Please say he's going to be okay," Logan whispered, staring at the doctor with pleading eyes, but the answer didn't come. The doctor merely averted his gaze, leaving Logan trapped in his silent anguish. Moments later, another nurse appeared and looked at the boy with a softer expression. "He's been taken into emergency surgery. His condition is delicate, but we're doing everything we can," she said, trying to give him some hope. Logan nodded slowly, his body still trembling. He sat down again, this time with the feeling that every beat of his heart was synchronized with Charles's fight for life. And there, in the coldness of that waiting room, he realized that their battle was far from over. Inside the operating room, the tension was palpable. Charles's heart stopped for a moment, and the team sprang into action. "Come on, cardiac massage, steady rhythm," ordered the surgeon as the team exchanged apprehensive looks. An assistant prepared the defibrillator, and another monitored vital signs. The monotonous sound of the monitor gave way to a stronger beep when the shock was applied, making everyone in the room hold their breath. "Rhythm restored," a nurse reported, and a sigh of relief echoed through the room. The team maintained their focus as they continued the procedure, their precise movements reflecting the urgency of the situation. Out there, Logan rubbed his hands, trying to push away the cold that seemed to come from within. "Please hold on," he thought, feeling the tears roll down his face. He saw a nurse pass by with a clipboard and almost asked about Charles's condition, but his voice didn't come out. Hours passed, and each minute seemed a greater challenge than the one before. Logan's hands ached from clenching his fists so tightly, and his mind oscillated between hope and fear. What if he doesn't survive? What if everything we've built together ends today? He thought, his heart racing. Finally, the doors to the operating room opened. The surgeon came out with a tired expression, but with a slight smile that said more than words. "The surgery was successful. Charles is stable, but he will need rest. You can see him soon." Logan let out a sob of relief, his legs almost giving way beneath him. Thank you," he repeated, his voice choked and his heart still beating erratically. He let himself drop into a chair, feeling a wave of emotion that made him dizzy. Minutes later, Logan was led to Charles's room. The man was surrounded by machines, the rhythmic sound of the monitors offering a fragile assurance that he was still there. Charles slowly opened his eyes and smiled when he saw Logan. "You came back," said Charles, his voice weak but full of affection. Logan approached, carefully holding his hand. "I never left, sir," Logan replied, his eyes still watery. Charles closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. "Logan, there's something I've never asked. What did you want in return for having returned that briefcase?" he said with a tired smile. Logan looked down, nervously fiddling with the hem of his shirt. "I never wanted money, sir. I always wanted there to be a place where kids like me could have a chance, a place where no one would be judged for their background. If you were to reward me for what I did, I would ask for that. I want none of them to go through what I went through. I want them all to have food and love, just like I have with you." Charles' eyes filled with tears, and he couldn't contain his emotion. "You returned something so valuable, and all you wanted was to help others. Your heart is nobler than many I've known in life." Logan felt a warmth in his chest, something he couldn't describe. "No one deserves to grow up without knowing what it means to have hope, sir. I just wanted to make a difference." Charles smiled, squeezing Logan's hand tighter. "Then let's do it together. And more, Logan, I want you to know that from today on you have a family. If you want, I will adopt you." Logan's eyes widened, hardly believing what he was hearing. "Adopt? You really want to, sir?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes, my boy. You are more than a guest. You deserve a home, a place where you will always be loved and respected," Charles replied, tears finally streaming down his face, marking a new beginning for both of them. Days later, the sun shone softly over the Lancaster mansion, casting a golden glow that seemed to herald new beginnings. Charles, still looking frail but with a serene smile, was discharged from the hospital. Logan walked beside the wheelchair, carefully holding the handle of the chair. The return home had a different flavor. It was not just the end of a medical journey, but the beginning of a new stage for both of them. As soon as they passed through the gate, the neighbors who had once looked at Logan with suspicion now approached with warm smiles. A gray-haired woman with a welcoming expression was the first to speak. "Welcome back, Mr. Charles." "And Logan, what a hero you are, boy," she said, a sincere sparkle in her eyes. Logan smiled, still shy about the sudden change in attitude from the neighborhood. "Thank you, Ma'am," he replied, unsure how to handle so much kindness. Charles watched it all with an emotional look. Seeing Logan finally being welcomed by the community made every battle he had faced worth it. More people approached, shaking Charles's hand and greeting Logan. A woman in a blue dress crouched down to look Logan in the eye. "I heard what you did for Zoe. You're a very special boy," she said, her voice overflowing with gratitude. Logan felt his cheeks flush and simply nodded, a small but sincere smile appearing on his lips. Hazel, who had once been one of the most critical voices, walked up to them with Zoe by her side. The girl ran and hugged Logan, making his heart race in surprise. "Thank you for saving me, Logan. I'll never forget that," Zoe said, hugging him tightly. Hazel, her eyes brimming with tears, approached and extended her hand to Charles. "Mr. Charles, I'm sorry for everything, for my judgment, my prejudice. Logan showed us all what true courage and kindness really mean," she said, her voice faltering for a moment. Charles looked at her for a moment, weighing every word, and then nodded. "Life has a curious way of teaching us lessons, Hazel. The important thing is that we learn and change," he replied, gently shaking her hand. He turned to Logan, who was looking at the scene with wide eyes. "See, my boy? Even the hardest hearts can be touched," Charles said, smiling slightly. Logan felt a wave of emotion pass through him. For the first time in a long time, he felt that he was part of something bigger, that he had a place in the world. The memory of the days when he begged on the streets seemed distant, like a bad dream that was finally left behind. "You are more than this neighborhood deserves, Logan," a neighbor commented with an affectionate smile. "I'm glad everyone can now see what I've always known." As the day went on, the mansion came back to life. Friends and neighbors gathered to celebrate Charles's return and acknowledge Logan's courage. Charles, observing it all from the porch, felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. "This is the true meaning of community," he thought, as he watched Logan running from one side to the other, laughing with Zoe and other children. And to think it all started with a lost suitcase. By late afternoon, when most of the visitors had left, Logan sat down next to Charles on the porch. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange. "Mr. Charles, thank you for believing in me," said Logan, his voice choked with emotion. Charles took his hand and squeezed it tenderly. "It was you who taught me to believe again, Logan. You brought new meaning to this house and to my life," he replied, his words laden with emotion. Logan looked out at the horizon and felt for the first time that the future was promising. He had a home, a family, and a dream that would soon become a reality. The support center he had so desired. "We're going to do great things together, Mr. Charles. I promise no one will feel alone as long as I can help it," Logan said, a smile lighting up his face. Charles laughed softly, feeling tears well up in his eyes. "And I'll be here to see every moment of it, my son. Every moment." Weeks later, the mansion and the entire surrounding community were buzzing with renewed energy. The inauguration day for the Charles and Logan Children's Support Center had finally arrived. The facade of the old manor had been transformed into a welcoming space, with large colorful windows, drawings made by local children, and a sign announcing the name of the place in golden letters. Charles, now stronger and with his health stabilized, was on the mansion's porch in his wheelchair, watching the crowd gather. Logan was by his side, his eyes shining with emotion and a mixture of nervousness and happiness. Several children from the neighborhood and others who had previously roamed the streets now had a safe place to go. The murmur ceased when Charles raised his hand in a simple yet authoritative and respectful gesture. "Today is a day of celebration and renewal," he began, his voice strong and full of emotion. "This center is not just a building but a symbol of hope, built from the courage of a boy who taught me the true meaning of kindness and altruism." All eyes turned to Logan, who blushed but remained poised. Charles continued with an emotional smile. "Logan showed me that true wealth lies in small acts of courage. It was he who made me realize that it's not enough to live for oneself. One must extend a hand to those most in need. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, and Hazel in the back discreetly wiped away a tear that had escaped. Zoe, next to her mother, smiled at Logan, who returned a look of complicity. "I remember the day I found Logan on the street," Charles continued, his voice choked with emotion. "At that moment he returned something that could have changed his life, but he chose honesty. And today it is that same honesty that unites us here." Logan stepped forward, feeling his heart beating rapidly. "I didn't do anything alone, Mr. Charles. If it weren't for your kindness and believing in me, I would never have imagined that a place like this could exist," he said, his voice strong but full of emotion. Charles smiled, his eyes glistening. "But you took the initiative, my boy. And that's why this center not only bears my name, but has the soul of all those who believe the world can be a better place." The children gathered in front of the center began to applaud, followed by the adults. It was a moment when the painful past of many present seemed to be erased, giving way to the hope of a promising future. Hazel approached, her eyes red from crying so much. "Logan, I owe you so much. If it wasn't for your courage, I wouldn't have realized how much I judged without knowing," she said with a sincere smile. Logan smiled shyly and nodded. "The important thing is that today we're all together," he replied, and a feeling of unison swept through the crowd. Charles raised his hand once more. "This center will be a refuge, a home for those in need. No child will go hungry, cold, or feel unwanted as long as Logan and I are here," he declared, and an echo of applause resounded. The doors of the center were opened, and everyone was invited inside. The space was cozy, with murals painted by the children themselves and toys scattered around. A large table was set up with food for everyone, and the laughter of children filled the space. "We're going to make this place something great," Logan said to Charles, his eyes shining with hope. "It already is, my son, it already is," Charles replied with a proud smile. Days after the opening of the Children's Support Center, the place was filled with children running and playing. The sun shone high, bathing the space with a warm light that seemed to symbolize the new chapter in everyone's life there. Logan and Zoe were in the central courtyard, laughing as they played ball with other children. The sound of laughter echoed through the air, spreading a contagious energy. "Logan, pass the ball!" Zoe shouted, her hair fluttering and her face lit up by a smile. Logan kicked the ball with precision, and it landed right at his friend's feet, who gave a triumphant laugh. On the veranda, Charles watched the scene with a satisfied smile. There was a special gleam in his eyes as he saw Logan interacting with the other children. Fearless and without the shadow of the past that had once haunted him, he couldn't help but feel immense pride in all they had accomplished together. "Mr. Charles, don't you think this is the best day ever?" asked an employee of the center, approaching with a tray of juices. She too watched the children, her heart warmed by the joy that reigned there. "It certainly is one of the best. This place now has life, has purpose, and it all started with the honesty of a boy who had nothing but decided to do the right thing," Charles replied, his voice emotional. Logan looked towards the veranda and waved excitedly when he saw Charles. He ran to the house with Zoe right behind him and stopped in front of the man he now considered his father. "Mr. Charles, did you see? Zoe tried to score a goal and couldn't," Logan joked, laughing as Zoe made a challenging pout. "You two are quite the pair," said Charles, also laughing. He extended his hand and Logan held it affectionately, feeling the connection that had forever changed his life. The center was filled with colors, with murals painted by the children and toys scattered across the lawn. Some of the neighbors who had previously kept their distance now helped with the activities, participating in art workshops and reading sessions. One of the neighbors organized a group of children to sing a song they had rehearsed during the week. It was a celebration of everything the community had become, a place of inclusion, support, and love. "Mr. Charles, do you know what I love most about here?" Logan asked, sitting on the edge of the veranda next to Zoe. "What, my boy?" Charles replied curiously. "That everyone here can be who they really are. No one judges, no one looks sideways. Here we're all part of something bigger," Logan said, a gleam in his eyes showing how much he valued that space. Zoe nodded and added, "And it's all because of you, Logan. If you hadn't returned that briefcase, none of this would be happening." Logan smiled, his eyes brimming with emotion. "And if Mr. Charles hadn't believed in me. I would never have had this chance. Now we can give this to so many other children, he said, looking at Charles with gratitude. You're right, Logan. This is just the beginning. We're going to help as many children as we can, so they know they are loved and deserve a dignified life, Charles declared, his voice laden with hope and determination. The shadow of the past, which had once threatened everyone's peace, had finally dissipated. Franklin and Malcolm remained imprisoned, facing the consequences of their actions. The city now saw them as examples of what greed and lack of compassion could cause. As the day wore on, Logan and Zoe continued to play, running through the courtyard as the sun began to set on the horizon. Charles watched, his heart filled with peace. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned his head to see one of the neighbors smiling. "You've created something very special here, Charles. You've transformed lives," she said, with an affectionate smile. "I didn't do it alone. It was Logan who brought this change to all of us. He reminded us of what really matters," Charles replied, looking at the boy who was now his son. The tired children from so much playing began to gather around a large storybook Logan held. He read aloud, with intonation and enthusiasm, while Zoe did funny voices for the characters, eliciting laughter from everyone. "And that's how the little hero discovered that the true treasure was in his heart," Logan read, closing the book with a smile. The children's applause filled the air, and Charles felt a solitary tear run down his face. "Thank you, Logan," he murmured to himself, knowing that this new reality was living proof that good can always win, even in the most difficult circumstances. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next stunning narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links that are appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, full of valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.